Now, once you had these telegraphs and you could send time, you could have the possibility of actually coordinating clocks throughout a wide area with some precision. And indeed, the trains became very concerned about doing just that. Because the big question was, if you ran a train line over a long longitudinal distance, say from Boston to Chicago, or from Chicago to LA, or from one side of Russia to the other side of Russia, what time did you use? Did you use the time of the town where the station was? After all, you had a local jeweler who typically would be fixing noon by looking at the noonday sun and setting clocks in his store that other people would then check their watches and clocks against. Or do you use the time where the train arrives or the train starts? So the first time zones were actually a couple of feet wide and thousands of miles long. The train tracks themselves became a kind of time zone set by the city where the train began its voyage. So if it began in New York, you used New York time. If it began in LA, you used LA time. If it began in Moscow, you used Moscow time. In this way, people began to have the train time, and then you would have the local time of the town that it was going through. So you have village time or town time or city time and train time. But what if you had two train tracks crossing in a town? Then you had, say, a New York time, a Chicago time, and the local time. And you could see how this rapidly leads to insanity. The great standardization of American time was introduced by the railroads. And the railroad magnates who made this decision set and divided the country into zones, orange slice-like zones, in November of 1883. They actually voted on this, the trains voted on this, by the number of miles of track you had. So if you were Leland Stanford, for example, and you owned thousands of miles of tracks, you got thousands of votes. So a couple of the leading magnates of the train industry divided up the country into these zones. As soon as you had these zones, the towns began to conform to the time zones that were set by the trains. And in fact, Harvard University began selling time. They had clocks that were attached to their very sophisticated observatory, and when the clocks would measure a certain time, they would send pulses down telegraph lines that went to the train tracks and then out across New England. But the issue of competition went deep. Not just, say, Harvard time versus Yale time, both of them were trying to control as much of New England time as they could, but between Paris and London. In London, Greenwich Observatory, which is just outside the main part of the city, was competing with the Paris Observatory, which you can see from the Jardin de Luxembourg. And they were ferociously battling about who would set the zero of time. Where is the zero of longitude from which all the other times will be determined? The French said, we have a long philosophical tradition. We're the people that brought the kilogram and the kilometer. Why would you do anything that wasn't philosophically grounded? And the British said, well, we sell maps to the most clients in the world. Most of the world's shipping are our clients, and they use our Admiralty maps. And the French said, clients? We're speaking of the division of science, and you speak to us of clients? Well, the French suspected the British of having fixed the election by paying off some of the small countries into a kind of coalition of the willing, which in fact, They were right, the British had, and the Americans and the British had conspired to fix this election rather clearly, and they won. They set the zero of longitude and therefore the zero of time at Greenwich Observatory. Well, this centralization of world time, the organization into zones based on the time of Greenwich, was a kind of symbol and universal aspiration of what time could mean. But time had other things to other people. The anarchist Prince Kropotkin in 1898-99 said, after a week's stay with the watchmakers in Switzerland, my views were settled. I was an anarchist. Well, anarchism was on the rise throughout much of Europe at this time, and many anarchists from France and Italy had taken refuge in London, including a fellow named Martial Bourdin, who began to plot an attack It was thought to be an assault on the Greenwich Observatory. He built a bomb and was carrying it up the hill towards the observatory when he had what's called these days a work accident, and unfortunately for him, blew himself up below the Tower of Time. This incident, when it occurred, led the people who were running the time room at the observatory to say one to the other, "Mr. Hollis, spot the time, 4:51. Well, what for Bourdin was the end of his life was for them the triumph of the imposition of time back on the threat to their own existence. This incident struck Joseph Conrad as enormously important, and in his most popular book, The Secret Agent, he used this incident of Bourdin to create a fictionalized version of this assault on the center of time, on this universal governing, controlling, scientific aspiration to map the world's times. And just to add yet a third chapter to that story, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, when he was attacking scientists around the country, modeled himself on one of the figures from The Secret Agent, which was a fictionalized version of Bourdin's attack on Greenwich. So you have a back and forth between the hardest edge of reality, of explosions and attacks and assaults and anarchism and terrorism, and the practical aspects of navigation and mapping and control of the world, with fiction. And back and forth it went, because time was always more than just a technique. Time was part of a political symbolism. Time was part of a literary symbolism. Time was part of a technological goal that was shared by scientists around the world.